Have you ever wondered whether there's something wrong with you? Perhaps you've been diagnosed with ADHD. Perhaps you've been told you're autistic. Perhaps you've come across the term neurodivergent and finally felt like you had an explanation. Or perhaps nobody has given you a label, but you've always felt different. Maybe your mind never seems to switch off. Maybe you're highly sensitive. Maybe you become overwhelmed more easily than other people. And maybe you've spent years wondering why life seems harder for you than it appears to be for everyone else. Now, let me ask you a different question. What if the problem isn't your brain? What if the problem isn't your sensitivity? What if the problem isn't the way you're wired at all? What if the problem is that you've spent years trying to become somebody you're not? Now, over the last 25, 6, 7 years, I've worked with thousands of people suffering from fatigue, burnout, anxiety, ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and more latterly, long COVID. And one thing I've noticed again and again is this. Many of the people who struggle most are also some of the most creative, intuitive, empathic, and insightful people I've ever met. In fact, many of the people I've worked with suffering from fatigue share the following characteristics. They feel deeply, they care deeply, they think very deeply, and they notice things that other people miss. And increasingly, many of them identify with terms such as ADHD, autistic, neurodivergent, or highly sensitive. Which raises an interesting question. What if some of the very qualities we've been taught to see as weaknesses actually contain extraordinary strengths? Now, I want to be clear, I'm not here to challenge anybody's diagnosis. And I'm certainly not suggesting that people's struggles aren't real. For many people, labels such as ADHD or autism, neurodivergence, brings enormous relief. They help people understand themselves. They help people make sense of experiences that may have felt confusing for years. But what interests me is something deeper. Because underneath all the different labels, I see a common thread. I see people fighting against themselves. People trying to suppress aspects of who they are. People trying to fit into ways of living that simply just don't suit them. People trying to become what they think they should be rather than discovering who they actually are. And that also makes me wonder, what if these traits aren't defects? What if they're not mistakes? What if they're not signs that something has gone wrong? What if they're expressions of a different type of human wiring, a different natural design? Think about it for a moment. If you're naturally sensitive but spend your life trying to become insensitive, or naturally creative but spend your life forcing yourself into rigid systems, and if you're naturally intuitive but have learned not to trust yourself, eventually there is a cost. It takes energy. It creates stress. And over time, the body and mind begin to protest. One of the central ideas within my work has always been that the body always knows best. The body constantly communicates. The body constantly guides us. Yet many of us have spent years living almost entirely from the mind, trying to think our way through life, trying to manage ourselves, trying to fix ourselves, trying to become acceptable in order to become normal. But what if the goal was never to become normal? What if the goal was to become the full version of yourself? What if some of the qualities you've spent years trying to suppress actually contain some of your greatest gifts? Now, that doesn't mean there aren't challenges. Of course there are. Every way of being comes with strengths and difficulties. But perhaps the question isn't, how do I fix myself? Perhaps the better question is, how do I better understand myself? How do I work with my natural wiring rather than against it? How do I stop fighting who I am? These are questions that I've become increasingly interested in over recent years, because I genuinely believe that many people are far more extraordinary than they've been led to believe. Not broken, not defective, not wrong, simply wired differently, and perhaps wonderfully so. Now, over the past year, I've been creating a new program called Wired for Wonder, which explores many of these ideas in much greater depth, and I'll be sharing more about it in the coming weeks. But for now, I'd love to hear from you. Do any of the things I've talked about resonate with your own experience? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, take care. Bye.